You want what? The clerk looked up from his sandwich. Out past the trailer window, 1,000 bales of raw wool sat rotting on a dead mill's loading dock. Every one of them stamped, in red, rejected. All of it, the boy said. I'll haul it myself. You don't pay me anything. Son, it's garbage. It'd cost us $75,000 to dump that. I know. The clerk laughed, not cruel, just confused, and signed without reading a single line. He'd forgotten the kid's face before the door shut. He was 17. Grandmother 4 months buried. Town 400 jobs dead. And 200,000 pounds of somebody else's trash, signed over for the price of a joke. What did he see that an entire town couldn't? Kestrel Falls sat in the low hills of Yadkin County, North Carolina, and for 61 years, the whole town had been arranged around one building, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet. Rathbone Worsted Mill ran 3 shifts. The diner opened when first shift opened. The hardware store locked its door when the last shift walked out. 400 people went through that gate every day, and everybody else in town lived off the 400. Odessa Bell went through that gate for 31 years. She was not a weaver and she was not a spinner. She was a burler and mender, which meant she stood at a long table under a bank of hot lights while finished worsted crawled past her at the speed of a slow river, and her entire job was to find the place where the cloth had gone wrong. A slub, a broken pick, a knot the loom had swallowed and carried forward like a lie. She found it. Then she repaired it by hand with a needle so fine it looked like a hair, and she worked that mend until nobody downstream would ever know it had been there. 31 years of that. 31 years of looking at something a machine had ruined and refusing to agree that it was garbage. She wore a steel thimble on her right middle finger for all 31 of them, and by the end, the crown of it had a shallow dish worn into the metal. A soft dent shaped exactly like the pressure of one woman pushing a needle through wool a few 100,000 times. Isaiah was the boy she raised. His mother had been gone since he was 4, and nobody in that house had ever said the word father out loud. Not once. Not in anger, and not in explanation. Odessa raised him. That was the entire arrangement, and when she died, the arrangement did not get replaced. It just ended. She died in May of 2002. The mill died in September. 4 months. That was the whole margin. She spent 31 years inside that building, and she missed watching it close by 4 months. And there were nights afterward when he could not decide whether that had been mercy or robbery. What she left him fit in the bed of a truck. The house on Poteet Road, 2 bedrooms, wood siding gone chalky on the south wall. 4 months of overdue property tax, which the county had already put in writing twice. A folding steel rule that snapped open in 6 sections, with her initials scratched into the brass hinge. A stub of red tailor's chalk worn down to a wedge. The thimble, which he strung on a bootlace and hung around his neck the week she was buried, and which stayed there. And the book. It was canvas-covered, about the size of a hand, and the edges of the pages had swollen and gone wavy from 31 years of standing in the steam of a finishing room. It was held shut with a rubber band because the clasp had given out sometime in the 80s, and she had never seen a reason to fix what a rubber band already fixed. It sat on the kitchen table. It had sat on that kitchen table every day of his life, and he had never once opened it. The way you never look at a chair you have sat in 1,000 times. He was 17. He was tall in the way that arrives before the rest of a person does, with hands that looked borrowed off a bigger man, and he had left 12th grade in October. Not out of rebellion, out of arithmetic. The county wanted money in a specific amount by a specific date, and nobody in that house was earning it. Because by November, Kestrel Falls had become a town that was mostly parking lot. The mill's 400 jobs had gone somewhere across an ocean where the labor cost 11 cents on the dollar, and the shockwave had walked outward from that gate in every direction. The diner closed, the shoe store closed, The hardware store held on with reduced hours and a handwritten sign. Anybody who still had a running vehicle drove 50 miles to Winston-Salem to load boxes for a company that had never heard of Rathbone and never would. The rest sat on their porches in the middle of a Tuesday, which is a thing that does not happen in a mill town, and it made the whole place feel like a body with the power cut. Isaiah had an application in at a car wash out on the highway. $6.25 an hour. He had been told they would call. And in the evenings, he sat at that kitchen table across from a canvas book with a rubber band around it, and he did not open it. Because there was nothing in a mender's notebook that was going to pay a tax bill. And because a person can live a long time 3 feet away from the only thing that would save him. He was going to open it, but not for the reason anybody would guess, and not for another 5 weeks. And not until his hands had been broken open first. He heard about the wool at the auto parts store. He was there for a fuel filter for a truck that did not belong to him, and 2 men at the counter were talking the way men talk in a town where nothing is happening. There's a mountain of wool rotting on the Rathbone dock. Since September. Smells like a wet dog the size of a church. Isaiah did not laugh. He stood there with a fuel filter in his hand and asked 3 questions. How many bales? What condition? And who is responsible for getting rid of it? The first 2 answers were guesses. The third answer was the one that changed his life, and the man gave it without knowing he was giving anything away. Some receiver out of Charlotte, skeleton crew closing out the books, arguing with a hauling contractor about the price. Isaiah drove out that afternoon and stood at the chain link with his fingers through the wire. 1,000 bales. Stacked under a corrugated overhang along the loading dock, 4 high, wrapped in burlap, twine-bound, each one roughly 200 pounds compressed. Every single bale had been stamped on the burlap in red ink, and the ink had faded to the color of old brick, but you could still read it from 30 feet. Rejected. It looked like a mistake somebody had committed on an industrial scale and then walked away from. Here is why that wool was sitting there. And it matters, because everything that comes after depends on you understanding it. Rathbone was a worsted mill. Worsted is the long fiber system. The combing line strips out everything short and everything crooked and keeps only fiber that is long, fine, and straight, because that is what you need to spin a smooth, hard yarn for a suit. That line is a machine. And a machine has exactly one opinion. And its opinion is a shape. This wool was the wrong shape. Staple under 2 inches, 30 to 36 micron, which is coarse. Heavy crimp, meaning every fiber curled like a spring instead of lying flat. And packed with vegetable matter, burrs and seed heads and hay that jammed the comb teeth and made the foreman shut the line down and swear. So the mill stamped it rejected, which people in the industry treat as a verdict on the wool. It is not. It is a verdict on the machine. That wool was not broken. It was not spoiled. It was not sick. It had grown out of a living animal exactly the way it was supposed to. It simply was not the shape of the thing they had bought to process it. Nobody in that building ever wrote that down. They just wrote, rejected, in red, 1,000 times. The receiver's office was a trailer parked in the lot with a window unit running in November. Inside it, a man named Dale Fetters was eating a sandwich over a stack of invoices, and Isaiah could see from the doorway that he had the particular gray face of a man who has been assigned to bury something. Isaiah asked what the disposal was costing. Fetters told him because it was the only interesting number he had. $75 a bale to haul it to a landfill in the next county. 1,000 bales. $75,000. $75,000 to make something disappear. That figure was sitting on somebody's desk in Charlotte like a headache that would not quit. And every day it sat there, it got more expensive. Because the overhang was rented, and the clock did not care. Isaiah made his offer standing up with his hat in his hands, and it took him about 11 seconds. He would haul every bale, all 1,000, for free, No charge, no invoice, no conditions. Sign a release and he would have that dock clear inside a week. Fetters looked at him. This kid, 17 years old, 6 foot something, wearing a coat that had belonged to somebody bigger, standing in a trailer in a dead town offering to take on 200,000 pounds of garbage for nothing. And he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, a confused one. The laugh of a man who cannot work out the angle and has decided that if there is an angle, it is not his problem. Isaiah had written the liability waiver himself the night before, in pencil, on notebook paper, copying the shape of the language off the back of the county tax notice because it was the only legal document in the house. That waiver had a spelling error in the second line. It also had a signature on it from a person who was 4 months short of being legally able to give one, which meant that with a single phone call to any attorney in Yadkinville, the entire thing could have been unwound like a bad seam. Fetters did not read either one. He signed it, slid it across, and went back to his sandwich. And by the time Isaiah got to the door, the man had already forgotten him. $75,000 of somebody's problem, transferred to a 17-year-old for the price of a signature and half a minute of amusement. Isaiah walked back out to the fence and looked at the stacks and felt something open in his chest that was not confidence. It was closer to vertigo, because he had just won it. All of it. And he had absolutely no idea what he was going to do with it. He started loading on a Tuesday morning at 5:15, alone, with a borrowed pickup and a pair of bale hooks and a hand truck that pulled to the left. By the 4th bale, his forearms were shaking. By the 11th, his palms had opened up. 200 pounds is not a weight you lift. It is a weight you negotiate with. And he had 1,000 negotiations ahead of him and nobody to spell him. The wool smelled like lanolin and dust and something faintly sweet underneath, like clover that had gone to seed. He was on his second load of the second day when the county truck came up the access road. Wade Cutler got out of it with a stainless steel clipboard held against his hip. He was code enforcement, and he was also the county's economic development liaison, which in a place like Kestrel Falls in 2002 meant he was the man whose job it was to explain to people why the thing they wanted was not possible. He had a pressed shirt in a town where nobody pressed anything anymore. And he had a voice like sugar water, patient, slow, and completely certain. He waited until Isaiah had a bale up on the tailgate and was out of breath before he started talking. Men like that always wait. Property zoned residential, son. 200,000 pounds of organic material in a residential zone, that's a code matter. Raw wool at that volume carries lanolin. Lanolin's classified as a waste stream. A waste stream requires a permit, environmental review, very likely a containment plan. He said all of it kindly. That was the thing about Cutler. He never raised his voice. He handed you the wall and told you he was sorry about the wall. Then he tipped his chin up, the way a man does when he believes he is doing you a favor by explaining the world to you. And he said it. You're not built for this, son. Isaiah stopped with his hand on the twine. The sentence had 2 floors to it. Cutler said it standing in the first one, and he genuinely may have believed he never went upstairs. That is how it works, most of the time. Nobody hands you a document. They hand you a sentence with a basement in it, and then look at you with real concern in their eyes. And if you say one word about the basement, you are the one who brought it up. So Isaiah did not say one word. He looked at Wade Cutler for about 4 seconds. Then he hooked the bale, dragged it onto the truck bed, and set it down. Cutler wrote something on his clipboard and drove away, and the contempt hung in the cold air behind him like exhaust. That night, Isaiah sat on the porch step in the dark and did the only honest math available to him. On one side, the car wash. $6.25 an hour, 40 hours. And if he took it, he could maybe hold the tax off for a while. And eventually he would sell the house on Poteet Road. And eventually he would move to Winston-Salem and load boxes. And eventually he would be a man in his 40s who once had a grandmother who worked at a mill. And that would be the entire story. It was not a bad life. It was a life. Half the town was already living it, and they were not weak people. On the other side, 5 days of hauling 200,000 pounds of wool that a corporation had legally certified as garbage into a residential yard he was about to lose, for a purpose he could not name, using a back that was 17 years old and had to last him another 60. That was the choice. Not a brave choice against a cowardly one. A known loss against an unknown one. He took the second. He hauled for 5 days, 12 miles each way, back and forth on the state road, the truck squatting on its springs, tarps he bought with money he did not have flapping against the ropes. He stacked bales along the fence line and packed them into the old equipment shed, and when that filled, he stacked them in the yard in a block 8 feet high and covered them. And by Saturday, the house on Poteet Road looked like a small fortification built by somebody who had lost an argument with reality. Neighbors slowed down when they drove past. Nobody stopped. On the night of the 5th day, he came inside at 9 o'clock and could not close his hands. The blisters had broken and reformed and broken again, and his fingers had curled into a shape that would not release, and he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at them like they belonged to somebody else. The steel thimble hung against his chest, cold from being outside all day, and the canvas book was sitting there where it had always been sitting. He was not looking for wisdom, understand that. He was looking for a bank account number. He thought maybe she had written down something practical somewhere in there. Some policy, some buried account, some last piece of paper that would make the county go away. Because he had just spent 5 days acquiring 200,000 pounds of nothing, and he had run out of other ideas. He worked one hand open far enough to reach, and he slid the rubber band off. The first page had no account number on it. The first page had a sentence, written in her slanted hand, in ink that had gone soft and bloomed at the edges from all that steam. They call it a flaw because they're standing too far back. He read it, sitting in a cold kitchen with a rubber band around his wrist and both hands ruined, and he did not understand it. Not that night. He would not understand it for another 15 months, and by the time he did, it would have cost him nearly everything he had. But he read it, and something in him filed it away. The way you file a key to a door you have not found yet. Everybody knows what wool is for. Wool is for yarn. Ask any person on any street in America what you do with a sheep, and they will tell you that you spin it, because that is the only sentence about wool that has survived into the modern world. So that is what he set out to do. And that single assumption, which he never examined for 1 second because nobody examines the ground they are standing on, cost him the next 14 months of his life. He built the wash station behind the house out of things nobody wanted. 3 galvanized stock tanks on cinder blocks in a row. A barrel stove he dragged out of the equipment shed. A squat iron drum with a rusted pipe he wired through a gap in the siding so it would draw. Rainwater off the roof into a plastic drum because the well water in Yadkin County is hard enough to fight you. First tank got the hottest water and a scoop of lye leached out of wood ash, which is alkaline. Second tank was warm rinse. Third tank was cold and clean. The chemistry underneath it is beautiful if you slow down enough to look. Lanolin is a wax ester. Alkali turns it into a crude soap that dissolves and carries the dirt out with it, and hot water holds the rest in suspension so it lifts away from the fiber instead of settling into it. That is all scouring is. That has been the whole trick for 3,000 years. Sorting came first, and sorting was where he met his grandmother's hands. Her folding steel rule snapped open in 6 sections, and he used it exactly the way she must have used it 100,000 times, laying a lock flat against the steel and stretching it gently between thumb and forefinger and watching how it sprang back. Under 2 inches every time. under 2 inches with a crimp so tight the fiber tried to coil back on itself the instant he let go. Then the vegetable matter, picked out by hand because there is no other way to pick it out. The first bale took him 7 hours, and when he finished, his fingerprints had vanished under a film of lanolin so thick he could not get a grip on a doorknob. Then he tried to wash it, and he made the mistake everybody makes. He got the water too hot. He was reasoning like a person instead of like a fiber. Hotter is cleaner. Hotter is faster. He had the barrel stove roaring and the thermometer read 160 degrees, and he loaded in 40 pounds of clean, sorted fiber, a fifth of a bale, all that tank would hold, and let it sit for 20 minutes. When he reached in, it did not come out as wool. It came out as a slab, a dense, fused, matted sheet, hard as a saddle, one solid object where 40 pounds of separate fibers used to be. He stood in the cold with water running off his forearms holding the thing, and it was not the physical weight that got him. It was the weight of 2 days being gone. 20 minutes and one wrong number and it was over. That night he went to the book. It took him a while because her handwriting was small and she used margins the way a working person uses margins. But it was in there. One line, pressed hard enough into the page that he could feel it from the other side. Don't boil it. The fiber remembers heat the way skin remembers a burn. Stay under 140. 140. Not 160. 20 degrees. That was the entire distance between usable material and a brick. He rebuilt the fire smaller. He watched that thermometer like it owed him money. 135, 138. He pulled at 140 and not 1 degree past it. And this time the fiber came out loose and open and springy, and the lanolin lifted off the surface of the first tank in a yellow scum that he skimmed with a slotted spoon. Clean wool, pounds of it. He had solved it. And then he tried to spin it, and the real wall showed up. He carted it by hand until his forearms shook. He bought a second-hand wheel off a woman outside Elkin for $20 because the treadle was cracked, and he glued the treadle. He drafted and the yarn snapped. He drafted thicker and got a lumpy rope. He drafted thinner and it snapped again, in the same place, in the same way, over and over for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Every evening under a bare bulb, producing nothing but tangle and a specific kind of shame. And he could not see why, because the answer was too close to him. The fiber was too short. 2 inches will not hold a twist under tension because there is not enough overlap between one fiber and the next to grip. It was never going to become yarn. It did not want to become yarn. He was standing over a material that had been telling him plainly every single night in a language of snapped ends that he was asking it to be something it was not. He did not hear it. He just pulled harder. Meanwhile, the town had made up its mind about him. The yard had been 8 feet high with tarped bales since November and had not moved. Somebody took a picture of it. And the name that stuck, the one that got said at the counter of the hardware store with a laugh that was not entirely unkind, and not remotely kind either, was the Garbage Kid. He heard it in March. He kept spinning. Wade Cutler came back in April, and this time he had paper. He got out of the county truck with the clipboard against his hip and walked down the side yard past the tarped bales and stood at the wash station while Isaiah was skimming lanolin off the first tank. And he waited, the way he always waited, until the boy had his hands full. It's the water now, not the storage. The water. It's running off the back of the property into the ditch. The ditch feeds Kestrel Creek. Lanolin-bearing wastewater entering a public waterway. That's not a warning matter anymore. That's a violation. $200 an incident. He held the compliance form out with 2 fingers, the way a man hands something to a person he has decided cannot read it. I'd hate to watch a young man dig himself deeper into a thing he's not built for. There it was again. The same sentence, the same basement under it. Said kindly. said slowly, by a man who would have been genuinely offended if you had told him what he had just said. Isaiah took the form. He read every line of it all the way down while Cutler stood there. Then he folded it once and put it in his back pocket and said 4 words. "I need a receipt." That was all. Not an argument, not a defense, not one syllable of the thing he was entitled to say. 4 words that closed a door in a man's face without ever raising a hand to it. Cutler blinked. He wrote out a carbon receipt off a pad, handed it over, and drove away. And that night, hunting through the book for anything about wastewater, Isaiah went past the mending recipes and into the last third of the thing. He had never been that far. The front of the book was work. Thread weights, mend types, the fault codes the mill used, sketches of weave structures with corrections drawn in. He had assumed the whole thing was that. The back third was not that. The back third was Odessa Bell writing about the mill for herself, in a hand that had gotten looser because nobody was going to grade it. And it went back decades. And he read it the way you read a letter from someone who has been dead for 11 months and has just started talking again. And then he hit an entry dated November 1974. Boiler ran away on 3rd shift. Whole lot of 400 blankets cooked. Every one of them felted up solid. Supervisor wrote it off as destroyed, $9,000 gone, and they hauled it out. I took 12 of them home. 30 years now, and those blankets are still here. The good ones wore through a long time ago. A machine hates what it can't hold. My hands never did. Isaiah read it twice. Then he sat back in the chair, and then he turned his head and looked down the hall toward his own bedroom. Because there was a blanket on his bed. Gray-brown, thick as a coat, so dense you could not push a finger through it, heavy enough that it flattened you into the mattress. It had been on that bed his entire life. It had been on that bed before he was born. He had asked her once when he was small why it was so heavy, and she had said, because it was made wrong. And he had accepted that the way you accept everything at that age, and never thought about it again for 17 years. He got up and walked down the hall and stood in the doorway and looked at it. One of the 12. He had been sleeping under the answer his entire life. Here is what broke open in that kitchen, and it is the whole story, so stay with it. Felting is not a failure. Felting is a product. A wool fiber is not a smooth filament. Under magnification, it is covered in overlapping cuticle scales, like shingles on a roof, all facing the same direction. Add heat, add moisture, add alkali, add mechanical agitation, and those scales lift, and the fibers migrate past each other in one direction only. And then the scales lock. They ratchet. They cannot back out. It is not glue and it is not weaving. It is an irreversible mechanical bond. And once it happens, you no longer have fibers. You have cloth. And here is the part that turned Isaiah Bell's life inside out in about 4 seconds at a kitchen table in April of 2003. Coarse fiber felts harder than fine fiber, because a thick fiber carries a bigger, more aggressive scale structure with more grip on its neighbor. Crimped fiber felts harder than straight fiber, because a spring-shaped fiber tangles with everything around it instead of lying politely beside it. And short fiber felts readily, because short fiber means more ends per ounce. And every end is one more place to catch. Coarse, crimped, short. Read those 3 words again, and then remember what was stamped on 1,000 bales in the yard outside. The exact 3 characteristics that made Rathbone's combing line reject that wool were the exact 3 characteristics that made it premium felting stock. Not adequate. Premium. It was some of the best raw felting material in the eastern United States, and it had been condemned to a landfill by a machine whose only opinion was a shape. And felt does not become yarn. Felt skips yarn entirely. Felt becomes cloth, and cloth becomes a coat. There was one more thing, and it was almost too neat, except that it was simply true. The line between destroying that wool and creating something out of it was the same 20 degrees. Under 140, gently, and you get clean fiber. Over 140, with pressure and friction and intent, and you get a fabric that nothing on earth can pull back apart. The difference between ruin and a finished thing was 20 degrees, and a pair of hands that knew which one they were doing. The book had 2 more gifts in that same section, and he found them in the same week. The first was a drawing, a trench lined with gravel, then coarse sand, then fine sand, running into a shallow bed planted with cattail root. She had sketched it for the back garden and never built it, because she never had enough wastewater to need it. The lanolin feeds the cattails. The cattails clean the water. Nothing is wasted. He dug it in 4 days with a mattock and a flat shovel, hauled gravel out of the dry creek in 5-gallon buckets, and moved cattail rhizomes out of the boggy patch by the fence line. Inside 2 weeks, the cattails went off like a rocket, fat green shoots drinking that lanolin-rich water down, because chemically speaking, it is fertilizer. He carried a sample to the county lab himself and paid for the test with money he did not have. It came back clean, well inside limits. He mailed the results to Wade Cutler's office. No cover letter, not one word. The second gift was further back, and the handwriting was not hers. It was older and rounder, and Odessa had copied it into that book in her own hand, underneath a line explaining whose it was. Her great-grandmother's. A fermentation vat for indigo, bran, lime, wood ash, warmth, and patience. The kind of vat that is not a chemical bath, but a living culture, that has to be fed and stirred and read like bread starter, that goes sour if you neglect it and sulks if you rush it. The vat is an animal. It gets hungry, it sleeps, it gets angry. And if anybody ever tells you your people left you nothing, tell them to come look at this blue. Past that vat recipe, there were 9 more pages of plants, each one with a heading and a season and a warning, all in her hand. He read every one of them fast, because he was looking for blue. Remember that. He built the vat. He fed it every morning at 6. The first coat took him 26 hours. He felted it by hand on a table with hot water and soap and a bamboo mat, rolling and rolling until his shoulders quit. 4 millimeters thick, dense as bark. He dyed it in that vat and watched it come out of the liquid green and turn blue in the air, which is a thing that happens because of oxygen, and which never stops looking like a magic trick. He marked it out with her chalk and cut it and sewed it by hand, and the seams were bad and the sleeves came out half an inch different from each other. He hung it on a nail in the shed. It was ugly. It was also a thing that not one factory on this planet could have made. He sold the first 6 on a menswear forum in the fall of 2003 for $180 apiece. He set that price because it was the highest number he had the nerve to type, and the nerve ran out at 180. Look at what that actually was. 26 hours of handwork for $180 comes to $6.90 an hour. And that 26 hours did not include scouring. Nothing ever includes scouring. He had turned down a car wash that paid $6.25. He had built a workshop, resurrected a dead woman's chemistry, invented his way out of a landfill, and priced himself at 65 cents an hour above the job he had refused. That is not humility. That is a man who does not yet believe the thing in his hands is real. They sold in a night. Then 30 more people asked. He paid the county what he owed them, in full. For the first time since the envelopes started coming, and he stood at the counter in Yadkinville and watched the woman stamp the receipt and had to go sit in the truck afterward. And then he got greedy about color. Not about money, about color. That distinction matters. And it is the reason what happened next hurt the way it did. Indigo is slow. The vat has to be fed. It takes days to build, it can go off, it works in thin layers, and you have to dip and oxidize and dip again, and the blue arrives on its own schedule and not on yours. He had 1 vat and 30 orders. And pokeberry was growing on every fence line in Yadkin County, free, in quantities you could not exhaust with a truck. Pokeberry gives you a pink red that does not look like it should be legal. It is loud. It is fluorescent at the edges. It comes off the plant in about 40 minutes in a vinegar bath, and it goes on to wool like it had been waiting its whole life to get there. Ha ha ha! And when he pulled the first test piece out of that pot, he laughed out loud in the shed. Alone, at 10 at night. He dyed 30 coats. 30. He shipped every one of them. 6 weeks later, the photographs started. Somebody posted the first one on the same forum where he had sold them. A coat that had been the color of a struck match, hanging in a doorway. And it was not that color anymore. It had gone to a flat, dull, brownish nothing, like mud dried on a wall. Not aged, not softened, turned. Then another one, then 4 more. And then a man wrote a sentence Isaiah could recite from memory for the rest of his life. I paid $180 for a coat that changes colors. Pokeberry is a fugitive dye. That is the actual technical term. And it is a perfect one. It is not that it fades slowly the way natural dyes do. It is that the pigment has no stable bond to protein fiber at all, and no mordant on earth will make it hold. Alum will not hold it. Iron will not hold it. Nothing holds it. It sits on the wool like a guest already reaching for his coat. And then light and air come, and it leaves. Every dyer who has ever worked with plants knows this. It is not obscure. It is the first thing you learn. And it was in the book. 9 pages of plants, each with a heading and a season and a warning. Pokeberry was one of them. 1 line in her hand. And he had read it. He remembered reading it. This color lies. It's beautiful for 6 weeks and then it leaves you. He had read it and moved on. Because he was looking for blue. Because he was in a hurry. Because the pink was so loud in the pot that it drowned the sentence out. He had the answer. He had it in his hands. And his eyes went straight across it. They call it a flaw because they're standing too far back. He had stood too far back from his own grandmother's handwriting. That is the cruelty of that sentence, and the reason it is the spine of this entire story. It does not only convict the mill. It does not only convict Wade Cutler. It came for him too, the first time he earned it, and it did not soften the blow because he was the one holding the book. He sat in the shed with the thread open on a borrowed laptop, and he understood exactly what his options were. He could say nothing. 30 coats, scattered across 11 states, sold by a kid with no company name and no return address and no obligation on paper to anybody. Natural dye fades, he could have written. Everybody knows natural dye fades. It was half true. And half true would have held. He could have kept the $5,400 and kept building, and nobody would ever have taken him to court over a coat. He refunded all 30. Every one, full price. He wrote 30 letters by hand because he did not know how else to do it. And in each one he told them plainly what he had done wrong. Not that the dye was unstable, that he had known, and had gone fast anyway. He did not ask for the coats back. Several people kept them and wore them for years, mud-colored. And one of those coats turned up in a magazine photograph in 2019 with a caption nobody outside Kestrel Falls understood. The refunds put him at negative $1,240. He had no propane for the winter. He had a yard full of wool the whole town had already voted on, a wash station going cold, and a live indigo vat that needed to be fed and kept warm every single day. It was November of 2003. The temperature was dropping. And the only thing in that house with a pulse besides him was sitting in a barrel in an unheated shed. Here is the part he has never told a reporter. There was heat enough in that house for one thing: no propane. What he had was a wood stove, and scrap he cut himself, and one room he could hold above 60 degrees. An indigo fermentation vat is alive in the literal sense. It is a bacterial culture. It eats bran, and below 65 degrees the organisms doing the reduction stop working and then stop being. He could carry the barrel into the kitchen and burn wood around the clock and keep the vat alive. Or he could keep the wash tanks at 140 and keep making cloth he could actually sell. He could not do both. He ran the numbers in December, sitting at that table, and the numbers said the vat was a luxury and the cloth was survival, and he was 2 months out from losing the house. He chose the cloth. It was the correct decision. He has never once forgiven himself for it. The vat died in February. He went out on a Tuesday morning at 6, the way he had gone out at 6 every single morning for 10 months, with a scoop of bran. And he pulled the lid. And there was no flour on the surface, no copper sheen, no smell of the thing working. Just gray water gone sour and a sediment on the bottom that was never coming back. He had kept it alive for 10 months. It was the only living thing he had managed to hold on to since May of 2002. And it had died in his care, on his arithmetic, by his hand. He put the lid back on and stood in that cold shed for a long time with the scoop still in it. The rest came fast after that, the way it always does once one thing goes. The shop in Brooklyn that had written to him in October, the one that had asked about 40 coats and used the word exclusive, went quiet in December and stopped answering in January. He did not need to be told why. The forum had a thread about the color that lied, and it was 6 pages long, and it had his name on it. The county sent the notice about the house on Poteet Road, and this one had a date on it. And the Bales sat under their tarps in the yard, right where he had stacked them 15 months earlier, 8 feet high, exactly the same. Having done nothing for him but sit there and get rained on and make him the punchline of a town. 15 months. Everybody in Kestrel Falls had been right, and the boy had been wrong, and now there was arithmetic to prove it. Wade Cutler came past on the road in the county truck on a Thursday in February, and he slowed, and he put the window down. He did not have the clipboard out. That was the strange part. His voice was soft, and there was nothing in his face a person could have called cruelty. And what he said was worse than anything he had ever said with paper in his hands. There's no shame in it, son. Your grandmother was a mender, and a mender fixes what other people make. That's honest work. There's nothing in the world wrong with it. Then he drove on. That was the sentence that nearly did it. Not you're not built for this one. Because this one arrived as kindness, and it came with a whole life attached to it, a small, clean life with a ceiling on it, offered gently by a man who would have sworn he was being generous. A mender fixes what other people make. Isaiah went out into the yard that night and put his hand on the tarp rope. He had made up his mind. There was a hauling outfit in Statesville, and their number was written on the inside of a cabinet door, and they would take the whole yard for a price he could probably borrow. And by the end of the month, the property would be clean and saleable, and this would be over. And he would be a young man in Winston-Salem with a story he did not tell people. He pulled the tarp down off the front stack. The bales underneath had gone dark with age, but you could still read the red on the burlap, 1,000 times, in the dark. He went inside to find the number on the cabinet door, and the book was on the kitchen table, where it had been every day for 18 months, and every day of his life before that. He picked it up to put it in a box, because he was not going to leave it in a house that was about to belong to the county. That is the honest reason, not sentiment. Packing. The rubber band came off in his hand, and the book fell open. the way a book does when it has been opened at the same place for 31 years. They call it a flaw because they're standing too far back. He stood in his own kitchen in the dark, and he could see his breath. And he set the book down and did not go get the number. What he did instead took 21 days, and there was no drama in any of it. He started the vat again from nothing. Bran, lime, wood ash, water, and the pigment. And the heat he had refused it in December, because the wash tanks were cold now anyway, and there was nothing left to protect. 21 days of stirring it every morning and reading it and waiting for the flour to come up on the surface. On the 22nd day, it was alive. He made one coat, not 30. One. Real indigo, no color that lies. And seams he had practiced 400 times on scrap until his hand knew the pitch of them without looking. And then he did the thing his grandmother had taught him without either of them knowing it was a lesson. He cut a label for the inside lining. He cut it out of the burlap wrapping off one of the bales in his own yard. And he cut it from the section that still carried the stamp. And he sewed it into the seam by hand. Rejected, in red, faded to brick. He photographed it once on the workbench with a borrowed camera. No description, no pitch, one line of text. This wool was thrown away by a mill in 2002. The mill is dead. The wool isn't. Then he went to bed in an unheated house, under a blanket from 1974. The photograph did not do anything for 11 days. Then a stylist in New York put it on her page, and an editor put it on his. And by the end of that week, something in the neighborhood of 40,000 people had looked at one coat on a workbench in a shed in Yadkin County. And here is the thing Isaiah did not expect. The thing that told him what he actually had. They were not asking about the coat. They were asking about the label. 310 messages were sitting in that inbox on a Monday morning in March of 2004, and he read all of them. And the question underneath nearly every single one was the same. What does the red stamp mean? Why does it say rejected? Who rejected it? Because a coat is a coat. There are a lot of coats. But a piece of burlap sewn into a lining that carries the exact verdict a dead corporation handed down on the material the garment is made of, that is not a product. That is an argument. And people will stand in line to wear an argument. The message that mattered came on the second day. A retail group with stores in 4 cities. They did not want 6 coats. They wanted 800, delivered before fall. At $400 wholesale. $320,000. Isaiah read it standing in a kitchen where he could still see his own breath, in a house the county had put a date on. $1,240 in the hole, with a vat he had just brought back from the dead. $320,000 would pay the tax and buy the house free and clear and put propane in that tank for the rest of his life. And still leave 6 figures in a bank account belonging to a boy who had been the town joke 10 weeks earlier. He sat down with a pencil, and the arithmetic killed it in about 90 seconds. One coat was 26 hours of handwork. That was the honest number, and it did not count scouring. 800 coats was 20,800 hours. A full-time working year in this country is about 2,000 hours. That order was 10.5 years of one human life. They wanted it in 5 months. So the order could not be made by hand, which meant it had to be made by a factory. And there were no factories in Kestrel Falls anymore, because the factory in Kestrel Falls had been shut down and shipped overseas. And the only production capacity on Earth that could turn 800 coats in 5 months was the exact same offshore capacity that had killed Rathbone Worsted and sent 400 people home and thrown the last 4 months of his grandmother's working life in a landfill. He would have to take the money that came out of the mill's garbage and hand it to the thing that killed the mill. And that was not even the worst of it. That was the part he could have argued himself into if he had been a certain kind of person. The worst of it was the wool. because industrial machinery cannot felt this fiber. Machine felting runs on needle looms and roller systems built to specification. And specification means uniformity. And the entire nature of that wool, coarse, crimped, short, wildly inconsistent bale to bale, still carrying seed heads, is the definition of non-uniform. It is exactly what a machine cannot hold. It would be rejected by the next machine for precisely the reasons it had been rejected by the first one. To scale, he would have to buy good wool. Long, fine, even, spec-grade wool. The wool the machines want, which meant scrapping 1,000 bales in his own yard. Read that back. The offer that would save his life required him to throw away the exact material the entire thing was built on. To keep the story, he would have to sell the story. The wool went in the landfill after all, just 4 years late, and this time he would be the one paying for the truck. He drove out to the Rathbone dock before dawn. The gate chain was loose enough to walk through, and nobody had cared about that building in 18 months. He sat down on the edge of the concrete in the same spot where he had backed a borrowed pickup a year and a half earlier. And he did what his grandmother had done every working day of her life. He did not solve it on paper. He went and stood in the place where the work happened. And he looked at it. The overhang was empty. 400 people used to come through that gate. And the answer was so close to him that he had been driving past it twice a day for 16 months. The way he had slept under the blanket for 17 years. The problem was hours. He had 10.5 years of work and 1 pair of hands. 3 blocks from where he was sitting, and out along the county roads and up in the hollows past the creek, there were 400 people sitting on porches in the middle of a workday. 400 people who had spent an average of 2 decades inside this building. 400 people who knew wool better than almost anybody left alive in the United States of America. Unemployed. Every one of them. He wrote back to the retail group that afternoon, and the whole company that exists today came out of 3 sentences. 40 coats, 1 run, 1 season. Made in Kestrel Falls or not made. Then he added the line he had earned the right to say in February, in a cold shed, with a scoop of bran in his hand. Those are my terms. They agreed inside an hour. No negotiation, no counter, not 1 word about the number. Because that was the thing they were trying to buy. He had spent a week terrified that his limits would cost him the order. And it turned out his limits were the order. Nobody in New York needed another 800 coats. There were 800 coats on a rack in every city in America. What there was exactly one of, anywhere, was 40 garments felted by hand out of wool a dead mill had legally certified as garbage, in the town where the mill died. The 40 coats did not make him money. They lost him about $2,000, and he knew it when he typed the terms. And he sent them anyway. What the 40 coats bought was the only thing he could not make with his hands. A reason for 9 women to walk into a garage on a Monday. The wait list is what paid. 310 people had asked what the red stamp meant. He wrote back to every single one of them, personally, the way he had written 30 apology letters 4 months earlier. And he told them the truth. That his was the slowest coat in America, that he was 1 person in a shed, that they would wait a year and possibly longer, and that he would not lie to them about the date. 211 of them sent a deposit anyway, $900 each, direct, no store in the middle. That was the money, not the order. The order was the proof. The first call he made was to Verlene Poteet. She lived 4 houses down, and she had spent 22 years on the spinning frames at Rathbone, and she carried a dented green thermos everywhere she went, including out to her own porch. And she had been sitting on that porch on weekday afternoons for a year and a half. She had watched the garbage kid haul bales past her house for 5 straight days in November of 2002, and she had never once laughed about it where he could hear. The road was named for her husband's people. Isaiah had lived on their name his entire life without ever once thinking about it, which tells you something about how close a person can stand to a thing and still not see it. She did not ask what it paid. "What time you want me there?" 6 weeks later, there were 9 women around a felting table in the garage on Poteet Road. The average time they had spent inside Rathbone Worsted was 19 years. They knew wool in their hands the way you know your own stairs in the dark, and they took to hand felting in a matter of days, because the only thing any of them had ever lacked was somebody willing to build a table. He paid $17 an hour, which was more than the mill had ever paid a single one of them. And then he did a thing that made no sense to anybody watching. He was never going to run out of wool. Understand that. 200,000 pounds in a yard is enough to outlive a man twice over. He did not need 1 ounce of anything from anybody. Ever. He started buying anyway. Every sheep operation in the Piedmont has short staple clip. It comes off the belly and the britch. It is coarse and crimped and full of hay. No commodity buyer will touch it, and the farmer pays money to have it taken away. It is a line item in the negative column on every one of those farms, and has been for 100 years. Isaiah started buying it at 3 times the commodity price. 3 times. For the exact material they were paying somebody to dispose of. 14 farms across 3 counties inside 2 years. Not because he needed it. Because a man in a trailer had once handed him 200,000 pounds of the same thing for nothing and laughed while doing it. And Isaiah had decided somewhere in the middle of that laugh that whatever this was going to become, it was not going to be that. Not one of those farmers ever asked him why. You do not interrogate the only man who ever wrote you a check for that pile. Wade Cutler came back in the spring of 2005. The stainless steel clipboard stayed in the truck. That was the first thing Isaiah noticed. The second was that Cutler's shoes had mud on them, which in 3 years he had never seen. He stood at the fence line and asked a question. And it was not a compliance question. Counties had inquiries, 4 other small operations asking about wastewater, little places, a cheese outfit, couple others. They've all been told the same things you were told, and they've all hit the same wall. Somebody down at the office mentioned the Bell property's got a system that passes. He asked, carefully, chin still lifted a fraction out of habit, whether Isaiah would be willing to share the design. Isaiah went in the house. He came back out with a single photocopied page. The trench, the gravel, the coarse sand, the fine sand, the cattail bed, drawn by a woman who had spent 31 years finding other people's mistakes and repairing them so gently that nobody ever knew. He handed it to Wade Cutler and did not say a word. Cutler took it. He folded it once, put it in his shirt pocket, got in the truck, and drove away. And now the part that closes the circle so completely that people who hear it assume somebody made it up. In 2011, the Rathbone building came up for liquidation sale. Nobody bid. 61 years of brick and heart pine and 140,000 square feet. And nobody bid. Because the abatement and the demolition cost more than the structure was worth. The building carried a negative valuation. On a spreadsheet in an office somewhere, the number in front of Rathbone Worsted Mill had a minus sign in front of it, which is the exact thing that had been true of 1,000 bales of wool in September of 2002. The building had been rejected by the same arithmetic that rejected the wool, and the arithmetic was wrong in exactly the same way, for exactly the same reason. Isaiah Bell bought it for $61,000. The loading dock where he had wrestled 200-pound bales in the dark at 5:15 in the morning, alone, with blistered hands while a town laughed. That dock became his shipping dock. And in the second week, Cleaning out the foreman's office on the north end, he pulled open a drawer that had been shut since the day they locked the doors. Inside it, under a layer of dust, was a steel hand stamp. The ink pad in the box beside it had dried into a red crust. It was the original. The one. The stamp that had gone down onto 1,000 pieces of burlap and sentenced 200,000 pounds of perfectly good wool to a landfill, one bale at a time, by a man who was only doing his job. Isaiah carried it downstairs to the shop floor. He cleaned it, he re-inked it, he set it on the bench. It has not moved since. 24 years after a 17-year-old backed a borrowed truck up to a dead mill and asked for the garbage has an address, and the address is that same mill. Isaiah Bell is 41. There is gray coming in at his temples. His grandmother's steel thimble still hangs on a bootlace against his chest, and the dish, worn into the crown of it by 31 years of her needle, has not gotten one particle deeper, because he has never once put it on his own finger. Her folding rule rides in his back pocket, and the brass at the hinge has worn down about 6 millimeters from being opened and shut a few 100,000 times more. And her initials have very nearly worn away with it. The house is called Bell, not a name he chose out of a book, the only name that was ever in the building. 31 people work there full-time. 31. Nobody in that building has ever said out loud what that number is. There is no plaque. It happened the way those things happen, one hire at a time across 20 years. And one afternoon, Isaiah was looking at a payroll sheet, and the number was sitting there, and he had to go stand outside on the dock for a while. $9.4 million a year. Sold in Tokyo, in Milan, in New York. Out of a town, a spreadsheet closed in 2002. The wait list runs 14 months, and he has never once tried to make it shorter. He has turned down 3 acquisition offers. He has turned down more than that to mechanize the felting, from people with real engineering behind them and real respect in their voices. And the answer has been the same every time. And the answer is not sentimental. It is technical. There is no machine that can be trusted with that fiber, because that fiber is not uniform. And everything that makes it not uniform is the reason the cloth is worth what it is worth. Every yard that leaves that building is still made out of water, heat, alkali, and a pair of hands that know exactly where to stop. The vat gets fed every morning at 6. It has been alive for 22 years. It has a name, and the women on the floor use it the way you use the name of a coworker with a temper. Wade Cutler retired from the county in 2019. Before he left, he filed a letter of support with the Board of Commissioners for the reuse of the Rathbone property, and in it, he cited the cattail filtration system at Bell by name, and recommended it as a model for small agricultural processors across the Piedmont. He wrote it in that bureaucratic language he loved, with section headers and bullet points and phrases like demonstrated efficacy over a sustained operational period. He never told Isaiah. No call, no note, no handshake at the hardware store. Isaiah found out 3 years later, from a clerk in Yadkinville who mentioned it in passing while looking for something else. There are men who will never say the words, but there is a piece of paper in a filing cabinet in that county that amounts to a man admitting he was wrong. About the mill, about the wool, and about what a person is built for. And that is enough. That is more than enough. Verlene Poteet has her own shop now up the road making felted blankets. Her daughter runs the buying cooperative that takes short staple clip off 14 farms across 3 counties. The pile every one of them used to pay to throw away. What one boy did alone in a backyard with a dead woman's book, a whole valley does together now. It is spring of 2026, and there is a 17-year-old named Junie standing in the doorway of the shop floor with his hands shaking. His mother has worked the felting table for 11 years. Isaiah looks at those hands and recognizes them instantly, because he stood in a doorway at exactly that age with exactly those hands. And there was nobody standing there to recognize it. He gives him the canvas book. The rubber band has been replaced about 40 times. Junie opens it to the first page, and Isaiah says the only 7 words that were ever necessary. They call it a flaw because they're standing too far back. The boy looks up and nods and does not say anything, and does not need to. Junie's first coat is on the bench that afternoon. Bad seams, sleeves half an inch off. Isaiah picks up the steel stamp, the one out of a dead foreman's drawer, cleaned and re-inked 15 years ago and sitting on that bench ever since, and presses it into the red, and brings it down onto the label sewn into the lining. Rejected. Same stamp, same word, same ink. The only difference is that it is not a verdict anymore. It is a signature. He sets it down beside his grandmother's rule and walks out onto the loading dock. The same dock at the same hour, 5:15 in the morning, where the light is coming up over a town whose mill died and which did not.